We're back in the year of the Bible. I am Andrew Whaley. Today we address Paul's shortest letter, a letter that's for one particular individual, but we get to eavesdrop in on the letter. The book of Philemon, potato. Philemon is written by Paul. It's one of the few letters, it's the only letter actually of Paul's that we actually know the reason, specifically, the letter is composed. The other letters of Paul, we have to speculate based on context clues as to what all he's trying to address. Here it's very clear, it's very specific. Paul's in prison. While he's been in prison, he's met a slave named Onesimus who belongs to Philemon. Philemon is a friend of Paul's. Philemon is a prominent Christian in Colossae. He's wealthy. Philemon owns a house big enough for the entire church to meet in for worship. Philemon has slaves. He's a prominent member of that community. Onesimus has fled Philemon. He's run into Paul. He's converted to Christianity, and he's been very helpful to Paul in Paul's evangelical mission. But Paul hesitates to give Onesimus more responsibility until Onesimus is reconciled to his master, to Philemon. This is an interesting note for Christians in all times. Paul could be a utilitarian and say, look, this is working. Onesimus is doing a great job. We're just going to ignore this conflict with Philemon and try to gloss over it and keep going. But Paul won't do that because Paul's theology of forgiveness and reconciliation he knows in Jesus through the cross necessitates that human relationships be reconciled. That's an essential part of living the gospel. It's not always just about what's working. It's always about what's the right way to do this in relationship to Christ. So, Paul writes Philemon and says, I'm sending this letter, I'm sending Onesimus back to you. Paul says, I want you to welcome him as you would welcome me. Welcome him as a brother. There's conflict over whether that means set him free from slavery or just don't punish him when he returns home. We think, though, that Paul is hoping ultimately that Philemon will free Onesimus so that Onesimus can join Paul again and complete this mission that Onesimus has been so helpful with so far. Paul adds this line at the end where he says, prepare a room for me, Philemon, at your house, for I'm going to come and see you. It's though Paul's saying, I'm going to check on this and see if you've actually helped Onesimus out in this way. Now, there's a couple of questions about this letter. One, did Onesimus really just randomly run into Paul? I mean, the Mediterranean world is pretty big. Now, I've known coincidences like that to happen, and we say, it's a small world. So maybe that's what happened. Some scholars now think, though, that in Roman slave culture, if a slave was having a conflict with the master of the slave could seek out a mediator to help figure out the conflict. Perhaps Onesimus knew who Paul was, knew he could influence Philemon, and Onesimus fled intentionally seeking Paul to address this conflict. That would help make sense as to how that happened. It seems much more likely than that they just randomly ended up in the same place and ended up in prison together. The other thing that this letter leaves us with that's troubling is Paul does not explicitly say, Philemon, set Onesimus free, and while you're at it, set all the rest of your slaves free, for slavery is a sin against God. Nowhere in the Bible is slavery explicitly condemned by Jesus, by Paul, by anyone else. And unfortunately, Southern church leaders in the 19th century United States used those passages to teach that you could have slaves as long as you were a benevolent slave owner like Philemon to Onesimus. In our own Presbyterian church, leaders like James Henley Thornwell and Benjamin Morgan Palmer used letters like Philemon to justify the continuation of chattel slavery in the United States of America. I lament that the Apostle Paul didn't have the courage or the wisdom or the insight in his time to condemn slavery as against the way of God. But Paul was a human being, as we all are, bound to the historical and cultural realities of his day. But we have to regret that that wisdom from the Holy Spirit was not present then for what might it have prevented from happening in the world. So as we read Philemon, we lament, but we also celebrate the ways that Paul wants to practice his Christian principles over utilitarian success as he and Onesimus work together and as he seeks reconciliation between Onesimus and Philemon.